At exactly 3:47 a.m. on June 22, 2025, somewhere deep inside Russian-occupied territory, a weary locomotive engineer flicked on the cabin light to double-check his route manifest. He didn't know it yet, but he'd been under surveillance for over an hour, 73 minutes, to be exact. Not by satellites. Not by planes. But by silent machines the size of pigeons, drifting invisibly above, recording every glint of steel, every flicker of heat, every measured wheel rotation. In just 94 seconds, 840 tons of diesel fuel under his care would ignite into a hellstorm designed not just to destroy, but to humiliate. The trigger? Roughly $8,000 worth of reconfigured hobby drones. The kind you'd find in the hands of a teenager. Except these weren't toys. They were scalpel blades wielded by the surgical hands of Ukraine's most elusive special unit, Kabul 9. Over 35 kilometers away, nestled behind camouflaged netting in the woods of Sumy Oblast, for Ukrainian operators huddled over thermal monitors. Their connection? Encrypted Starlink uplinks hardwired to high-gain antennas. Their view? Live infrared video streamed from a trio of modified DJI Mavic drones circling the train like vultures. Through the thermal feed, the diesel engine was a lighthouse in the dark, glowing white-hot at 47 degrees Celsius against the chilled, dawn-kissed rails. The 12 fuel cars behind it shimmered with temperature gradients like paint swatches, each one a ticking oil drum to anyone with half a military brain. But make no mistake, this wasn't some improvisational ambush. Ukrainian military intelligence had been tracking this particular train for 96 hours, its every move relayed through a web of partisan spotters armed with nothing more than encrypted androids and sheer resolve. They knew its departure schedule from Rostovan Depot. They knew its cruising speed down to the kilometer. But most importantly, they knew its vulnerability, a 20-minute gap where no Russian air defense system could reach it. That was the window. And it was about to close. Each one of those fuel cars carried 70 tons of diesel, enough to keep a Russian tank battalion grinding forward for 72 hours. Do the math, 12 cars. 840 tons. That's 10 days of combat capability for 3 separate armored units. 10 days of war. Or 10 days of Russian frustration. That was the price tag of this one strike. And yet, the true brilliance wasn't just in the timing, it was in the tools. These weren't off-the-shelf drones anymore. Ukrainian engineers had rewritten their firmware from scratch. They now boasted 56x digital zoom, 45-minute flight endurance, and the kind of flight control precision you'd expect from a $10 million US drone, not something originally meant for weddings. The most terrifying upgrade, however, lay in their communication systems. A custom-built RF suite with frequency-hopping spread spectrum tech that danced across 1,500 frequency hops per second, like trying to pin down a firefly in a lightning storm. The Russians could jam signals all they wanted. These drones would laugh. And then came the payloads, the warheads. Each drone was armed with a 2.6 kilograms PG-7VL-shaped charge. Originally designed to punch through 500 millimeters of Soviet-era armor, now mounted under a civilian quadcopter. The copper-lined cone inside that warhead didn't explode in every direction. It focused all its energy forward into a supersonic jet, ripping through metal at 35,000 feet per second. Against a thin-walled fuel car? It might as well be a laser beam. At 45 kilometers per hour, the fuel train rolled unknowingly toward oblivion. The engineer adjusted his cap, maybe reached for a thermos. He had no idea he was now part of a case study in modern asymmetrical warfare. In 47 seconds, he'd learned the hard way why invading Ukraine is one of the worst strategic miscalculations since someone invested in MySpace during the age of TikTok. At 3:48 a.m., the countdown to impact had entered single digits. But just as the first drone adjusted its glide angle for terminal approach on fuel car number 4, something unexpected rumbled to life in the electromagnetic spectrum. A ghost awakened. Over the tree line, 11 kilometers to the east, the Russian Lear-3 electronic warfare truck kicked into full operational mode. Its crew had finally spotted the digital phantoms buzzing just outside the edge of their detection threshold. To them, this wasn't just interference, it was war. Within seconds, the truck's twin masts began vomiting RF interference across a 30-kilometer radius. Every unshielded cell phone in 5 nearby villages instantly lost signal. Radios crackled. Civilian drones fell out of the sky. The Russians had just flipped the kill switch on the invisible battlefield. The Lear-3 began with broadband jamming. Think of it as a foghorn on every frequency from 300 MHz to 6 GHz. White noise blasted across the ether, a blinding electronic smoke bomb meant to choke out all signals indiscriminately. But this was just the opening act. When the drones continued flying as if nothing happened, the Russian crew got nervous and aggressive. They switched tactics, initiating spot jamming. This time, the noise was more focused, zeroing in on the 2.4 GHz and 5.8 GHz bands, the same ones used by commercial drones and Wi-Fi routers. It was the EW version of screaming directly into someone's walkie-talkie. And yet, even this more precise assault failed to cut the strings. You see, Ukraine had planned for this. Their drones weren't just skipping frequencies like drunken ballet dancers, they were switching across 4 separate frequency bands, 1,500 times per second, coordinated through encrypted protocols only they understood. By the time the Lear-3 tried to track them, the drones were already gone, in signal space if not in the sky. Frustrated, the Russians went further. They activated GPS spoofing, not just jamming but deception. The Lear-3 began transmitting fake satellite coordinates, trying to convince the drones they were somewhere above the Indian Ocean or the steppes of Mongolia. To a lesser machine, this would have been devastating. But these weren't lesser machines. Inside each drone was an inertial navigation system powered by solid-state gyroscopes. These didn't care about satellites. They tracked movement the old-fashioned way, through physics. Every turn, every speed change, every bump was recorded internally. You could spoof the sky, but you couldn't lie to Isaac Newton. And if you tried, the drone would know. But the piece de resistance came next. As the lead drone slipped through the final 500 meters of its flight path, it did something completely unexpected. It unspooled a line. From its belly, a fiber optic cable began unraveling, thinner than a human hair, invisible to radar, and glowing with a faint shimmer under infrared. To the untrained eye, it looked like fishing line. But inside was light, 1.5 gigabits per second of raw bandwidth, enough to stream 1080p video, send telemetry, transmit GPS corrections, and control the drone in real time, all without a single RF transmission. To Russian sensors, the drone looked autonomous. It wasn't. The choice was genius. Radio waves can be jammed. Glass fibers? Not so much. But this choice came at a cost. Fiber optic cable adds drag. It adds weight. It creates a literal trail between operator and machine. The Ukrainian team knew this. They knew they'd have to relocate within minutes. But for guaranteed control in an electronic hurricane, it was worth every gram. As the Lear-3 blasted RF static across the countryside, Ukrainian drones danced through it like ghosts. Silent, invisible, controlled not through airwaves but light. And now, only 800 meters separated the first drone from its target. The Russians had brought an RF hammer. Ukraine brought a fiber optic scalpel. At 3:49 a.m., the Ukrainian operator monitoring drone 1 steadied his breath. His screen showed the crosshairs glowing red over car number 4. The moment of truth had arrived. Through the fiber optic feed, he could see every rivet on the fuel car's steel shell. A heartbeat later, the drone dived. The warhead hit with surgical brutality. The PG-7VL-shaped charge didn't just explode, it performed a mechanical miracle. The 85mm copper cone inside inverted under pressure, forming a molten jet that sliced through 15mm of steel like a laser through butter. The internal temperature spiked to 2,800 degrees Celsius. The steel didn't just melt, it vaporized. The 70 tons of diesel inside had no time to understand what was happening. 1 second, it was liquid. The next, it was a firestorm. The resulting explosion was not a boom, it was a detonation, a violent bloom of expanding gas and incandescent death. The shockwave flattened grass along the rails. The sound carried for kilometers. For a split second, the train's silhouette lit up like a negative photo flash across the pre-dawn horizon. But then, something unexpected happened, something no drone operator had planned for. The fire didn't stay contained. Soviet-era design flaws revealed themselves. The fuel cars, once engineered for pressurized transfer, shared a connected ventilation manifold running the length of the convoy. A detail forgotten by Russian logisticians, but not by physics. Burning vapors from car number 4 surged into cars 3 and 5 like flaming ghosts through an open hallway. Within 20 seconds, both had ignited. What began as a single-point detonation had turned into a chain reaction. The rail cars weren't just exploding, they were feeding each other fire. In the chaos, Russian crew members scrambled from their compartments. Eyes wide, confused, desperate. Then they saw it, Drone 2, screaming in at 160 kilometers per hour toward car number 8. Their response was frantic and hopeless. AK-74s snapped to shoulders. Muzzle flashes blinked across the tracks. But they were firing 5.45mm rounds at a drone the size of a crow, zigzagging at terminal velocity. It was like trying to shoot a bat in a hurricane while riding a runaway horse. The rounds forced Drone 2 to weave violently, but its operator kept control. And then fate twisted the knife again. The shaped charge on Drone 1, the one that had struck so cleanly, malfunctioned. Instead of a full detonation, it had only partially ignited. The hole it punched in the fuel car was incomplete. Car number 4 was ruptured and burning, but not destroyed. Watching through the fiber feed, the operator made a split-second decision, one no manual had trained him for. He dove the burning drone straight into the diesel pool, guiding the flaming wreckage like a kamikaze with a purpose. The drone smashed into the leaking fuel, erupting into a secondary blast that did what the warhead hadn't. Mission saved, barely. And then came the laws of unintended consequence. The towering fireball that now engulfed 3 fuel cars began generating convection currents, invisible rivers of heat pulling air upward at 60 km/h. The drones flying above were suddenly caught in invisible whirlwinds of hot air, like leaves in a wildfire. Drone 3, approaching car number 11, buckled mid-flight. Its path wavered. The camera feed jostled violently. The onboard stabilizers fought back, but the drone was now battling a firestorm of its own making. And as if that wasn't enough, Drone 2's fiber optic tether snagged. Mid-flight, the thin strand hooked itself around a railway signal post, halting the drone's freedom like a dog on a leash. Its range was now limited to a tight 30-meter radius. It circled, trapped, like a tethered falcon. The operator stared at his screen, faced with an impossible choice. Abort the mission? Or fly a pinpoint strike while tied to the ground like a kite in a hurricane? He chose the latter. Back in the engineer's cab, panic finally set in. The brakes were slammed. But 840 tons of steel and diesel don't stop just because you pull a lever. The train slowed, but too late. It was now a burning, stationary target. The battlefield was no longer theoretical. It was a living, breathing inferno. At 3:50 a.m., Drone 3 descended like a hawk through chaos. But this wasn't air, this was war weather. The inferno below had turned the atmosphere into a vertical blender of smoke, heat shimmer, and savage wind shear. The fire rising from cars 3 through 5 created updrafts strong enough to throw small helicopters off course. For a drone, it was like flying through a collapsing building. Every meter closer to the target brought more resistance. The thermal camera blurred. Heat distortion painted the landscape in waves. Laser designators scattered across airborne particles like sunbeams hitting dust. The drone's IR sensors? Half-blind. The onboard AI tried to compensate, but it wasn't enough. The Ukrainian operator was flying blind, navigating only by faint thermal outlines and instinct. Below, fuel car number 11 loomed through the murk. Just as the drone made its final descent, a gust tore through the fireline and through the quadcopter 15 meters off course. It spiraled, not out of control, but out of alignment. The operator yanked control back like a sniper adjusting mid-breath. He had 5 seconds to recalculate everything. Wind vector, altitude, target reacquisition. And as he corrected, a storm of tracer fire lit up the screen. Russian crewmen on the ground had spotted him. Bullets screamed through the air like red-hot comets. Most missed. One didn't. The drone's left rear rotor took a hit, stuttering, coughing, but still spinning. Stabilization dropped from 98% to 61%. The flight path became jittery. But the operator held it together. He gritted his teeth, dialed in one last course correction and dove. Simultaneously, Drone 2, still leashed like a warrior on a chain, surged forward for its final attack run on car number 8. The fiber optic tether strained against the railway post, reducing flight agility to a narrow cone. The operator had done the math. He had 1.3 seconds from visual lock to impact to account for drag, cable tension, and drift. It was an impossible shot. And then he made it. At precisely 3 hours 50 minutes and 27 seconds, drones 2 and 3 hit their respective targets within milliseconds of each other. Not just explosions, synchronized detonations. Their shaped charges punched into the fuel cars with such force and precision that the blast waves overlapped, amplifying rather than canceling. It was like 2 sound waves merging to create a single, bone-shaking bass drop. The resulting explosion was sustained, not a bang, but a roar. A wall of pressure thundered out in all directions, rattling windows in villages 5 kilometers away. 2 cars were torn open. Diesel mist ignited midair, creating clouds of fire that rolled across the landscape like something out of an oil field nightmare. But the real damage was just beginning. The heat, now climbing past 1,200 degrees Celsius, began to warp the very infrastructure supporting the train. The steel rails, designed for 60-ton locomotives, twisted like licorice. Welds popped. Bolts sheared. What had once been a symbol of Russian logistical discipline now looked like a modern art exhibit made of melted scrap. And then came Drone 4, the final bird in the sky. Its camera feed flickered red, battery at 8%. The fight through the thermal updrafts had drained power faster than expected. Every second of hover had cost it altitude. The drone now had 90 seconds to reach the locomotive or it would crash in a ditch, its mission unfulfilled. Its operator knew there would be no second chance. He pushed the quadcopter into a shallow dive, angling straight for the engine, the rolling $2.4 million core of Russia's supply line. The PG-7VL on its belly was armed, stabilized, and ready to detonate. But the drone was not alone in the sky. The fire had created convection towers of rising air, clashing with cooler winds and generating sudden horizontal turbulence. The drone dipped, then rose, then dipped again, tossed like a matchstick. At this point, even gravity seemed undecided. Still, the pilot pressed forward. Below, the locomotive groaned under its emergency brakes, wheels sparking against the rails. But it couldn't outrun what was coming. At 3 hours 50 minutes and 59 seconds, Drone 4 hit the front engine dead center. The warhead's copper jet tore through the engine block with cold precision, vaporizing its crankcase, its control panel, its very soul. The mission was complete. By 3:51 a.m., the smoke rising above the train could be seen from over 30 kilometers away. Not black, but deep orange and crimson, backlit by the inferno consuming 3 fuel cars and crawling rapidly toward a fourth. Flames danced like serpents across ruptured steel. Diesel-fed firestorms surged down the line, turning the rail corridor into a high-temperature hellscape. The heat alone, exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius, began fusing ballast rock to steel, melting train components into puddles of iron and copper. The once proud tracks, engineered for industrial precision, now resembled taffy twisted by a sadistic hand. Cross ties vaporized. Signal towers sagged and buckled. What had once been the spine of Russian armored supply had become its burning eulogy. For the Russians on the ground, the nightmare wasn't over. Ammunition in one of the auxiliary cars cooked off, not with a single blast, but in staccato bursts. A chaotic drumbeat of destruction, as though the train itself were rejecting its purpose in death. Each miniature detonation sent shrapnel whistling through the air. The surviving crew dove into drainage ditches, their rifles utterly useless against invisible attackers that never once fired back. And in a dark tent 35 kilometers away, 4 Ukrainian drone pilots sat motionless, bathed in the glow of fiber-fed video streams now flickering with static. Their mission was over. Their drones? Gone. But their job, done with mathematical perfection. The final tally was breathtaking. For roughly $8,000 in drone components, Ukraine had annihilated over $2.4 million in Russian rolling stock, plus 840 tons of diesel fuel worth more than $600,000. But the real victory wasn't in dollars, it was in time. That one train could have powered 3 Russian armored battalions for 10 days. 10 days of mobility. 10 days of offensives. 10 days of bloodshed that now wouldn't happen. Instead, those battalions would sit idle, out of fuel, out of options, and slowly realizing they weren't facing an underdog army anymore. They were facing something else, an enemy that rewrote the rules of war using consumer-grade tech and a bit of cold-blooded creativity. And perhaps most terrifying of all, none of the drones were controlled by AI. There was no Terminator, no Skynet. Just a handful of engineers, soldiers, and resistance spotters with encrypted phones, a few modified quadcopters, and absolute resolve. This wasn't the future of warfare. This was the now. The Russian Ministry of Defense would, of course, issue a vague statement blaming a fuel leak and sabotage. They'd downplay the loss, obscure the footage, maybe even stage a replacement train for propaganda purposes. But internally, panic would spread. Their $5 million Lear 3 jamming truck had failed. Their armored supply chain had cracked. Their entire eastern corridor just got slapped by a flying webcam on a string. Ukraine, meanwhile, would say nothing. No press conference. No TikTok footage. No leaks. Just silence. The kind that tells you someone's already planning the next strike. And somewhere in the woods, the Kabul 9 team packed up their gear, quietly rolling up the 9-micron wide strands of glass that had just checkmated a global military superpower. No gunfire. No glory. Just light, fiber, and precision. And a single, burning message left behind. You are not safe here.